parashat is interesting. It's a very unique one. As we go through it, you'll see why. But it goes from the war on the battlefield, starting with milchama, into the home, and from the home into the field, and from the field into the marketplace. Talks about our animals, talks about our economics. From marriage into employment, how we deal with employees, believe it or not. How you deal with people that work for you, or people that you work for. To the compassion that's required toward your animals. If you have animals, you're supposed to and required to have compassion upon your animals. And to the responsibility that you have for your neighbor. And finally, after all of these commandments in this parasha, the Torah brings us back to an enemy. He says in 25:17, remember that Amalek, what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt. Zakor. Remember what Amalek did to you. So this means that Teitzei begins with an enemy and ends with an enemy. Right? That's the bookends. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. This parashat begins with an enemy and it ends with an enemy. My wife highlighted to me this morning as I was talking through the parasha with her. She said, yeah, but that's what, we created the parasha. That's, not necessarily what God intended because we've divided it. And she's got a good point. But the division is for a purpose, and God even allowed us to create these parashot in the way that they are set up for us to learn very important lessons. And so everything between those two enemies, the war in the beginning, milchama, and the war with Amalek, teaches us how the people of God are supposed to live while surrounded by a world that doesn't reflect the character of God. So the great battle of Teitzei is not just the battle to defeat what's outside of you. It's the battle to prevent what's outside from getting inside. So God teaches you there's a war on the outside, a war in the beginning, milchama, al ovecha, you're going to go up against your enemy. And then he shows you at the very end Amalek. He says, always remember Amalek. But in between there, those bookends, he's talking about your life. Your everyday, ordinary experience. These commands are for the everyday, ordinary experience. And everybody argues them and fights over them and says, this command means that and this command means that. But there's an overarching 30,000-foot lesson that God is trying to show us here. And he's putting it together for us. So let's look at this. When you go out to war, ki teitzei. When you go out, there's an assumption that when you go out, you're going to experience conflict, right? Immediately from this parasha, you hear Moshe, we're being told that there's going to be a conflict. When you go out to war, la milchama. Israel is preparing to enter the land, and Moshe knows that covenant life isn't going to remove conflict from their existence. Just because you live within God's covenant doesn't mean that conflict is erased. The modern church can sometimes present a very different expectation of covenant life. I'm using that because, obviously we're starting next week. So it's a subliminal message. The church presents a very different expectation of what covenant life is, particularly in teaching that are shaped by certain forms of dominionism or triumphalism. where believers are taught to think that because Mashiach has given his people spiritual authority, hardship should continually retreat before you. You've received spiritual authority, so hardship should always retreat. You should see no hardship. The kingdom-minded people should always be advancing. You should always be prospering. You should always be conquering and exercising authority over every single circumstance. And what do they tell you? Just rebuke it. Rebuke it. Has no place here. Stand firm. God is sovereign. This will not affect you. You don't have to worry about it. We are conquerors. Hardship shouldn't be there. And then what happens is that if hardship is there, you have a sin in your life. You must have a sin in your life that you haven't reconciled. That's why you're experiencing this hardship. Because if you didn't have a sin in your life, you wouldn't have this hardship, because we are conquerors. That's not the expectation that Moshe gives Israel. He doesn't provide that to Israel. Moshe knows that the covenant life isn't going to remove the conflict from their existence. Covenant life is going to teach you how to remain faithful in the midst of conflict. How do you remain faithful in the midst of the conflict, the hardship, the trial, the storm? And so allow me to chase this rabbit for a little bit more, because it is a rabbit, because I'm going off on the modern NAR church. What we should understand through Scripture is that they never promise that belonging to God eliminates the battlefield. The battlefield's still going to be there. In fact, the battlefield's that we're still living beneath the consequences of the fall of Adam. Many people in Christianity don't understand that we're still living beneath the consequences of the fall of Adam. When the first man sinned, the curse didn't affect Adam alone. The ground itself was cursed. Thorns and thistles came upon the land, and you had to fight it and deal with it. Human existence became marked by painful toil, struggle, and ultimately death. Are we still dying? So Paul expands in Romans 8:20 through 23, and he explains that creation was subjected to futility and that the whole creation continues to groan as it waits its liberation. And so hardship's not necessarily evidence that the kingdom is absent or that a believer has failed to exercise sufficient spiritual authority. It is evidence that we are living between Gan Eden lost and Gan Eden restored. We're living in between the time that was lost and the time that was restored. We're still there. And Yeshua's already broken the ultimate authority of sin and death through his resurrection, as we see in 1 Corinthians 15:20 through 26. But Scripture looks forward to the day when his victory will be fully manifested throughout all of creation. His victory will be fully manifest for all of us. Yes, Yeshua resurrected, and yes, a few also resurrected with him as the first fruits of sorts. But yet we are still awaiting that same manifestation. Revelation 22:3 says that in the Olam Haba, in the world to come, no longer will there be anything accursed. So in the world which is coming, which isn't here yet, there will be nothing accursed. The curse will be gone, eliminated. And in Revelation 21:4, it promises what? The removal of death, mourning, crying, pain, all of it will be gone. And until that day, kingdom people shouldn't pretend that the curse has already disappeared. And the problem is that kingdom people are walking through this earth acting as if the curse doesn't exist, simply because they've made a sinner's prayer. Simply because they've said, I believe in you. They act as though the curse did not exist. Who else believed in him? Abraham. Did he struggle? For sure. It started with him. He's our father. Continue down the line. Pick one. The curse exists. And we live between these periods of loss and restoration. We should not be living as though the curse disappeared. We should live as witnesses of the coming kingdom in the midst of creation that's still groaning, trusting that what began with the first Adam will ultimately be rectified through Yeshua, the last Adam. Adam Rishon blew it. But Yeshua is restoring it. So let's get back to Israel. In this parasha, Scripture reveals that Israel possessed covenant promises, but they still encountered Amalek. So they had the covenant, they had Abraham as their father, Yitzchak and Yaakov as well. They go into slavery. By the way, for 430 odd years, they're in slavery, and they're the covenant people. Interesting, isn't it? They have this covenant life that they've been given, and they've been put into slavery for 400 plus years. Strange experience for them, given that God has called them to be special. An Am Segula. What church-going believer doesn't say that? I'm special. I'm a chosen creation. I'm precious to the Lord in His sight. Nothing, no harm can come nigh my dwelling. Really? The special people of God go to slavery for 400 plus years? Explain to me. This isn't God's fault. This is the fact that we live in a time that's cursed. It's because of our choice. The law has to be applied even in the real world, in the ordinary. David was anointed, but what happens? He flees from Saul. The prophets were called by God, and they suffered. Yeshua possessed all authority and yet willingly walked through rejection, suffering, and death. And even the apostles understood kingdom authority wasn't just an exemption from hardship, but as the power to remain faithful through it. This is what they got. We have the power to remain faithful to God through the hardships. This was the lesson. It's not the lesson of the modern church. Biblical victory cannot just mean that the believer exercises enough authority to remove every obstacle before them. Sometimes victory is deliverance from the battle, but sometimes and oftentimes it is the grace to remain obedient within the battle. We have to stay obedient in it. It's easy. You want God to take it away from you. Take this pain, take this hardship, take this away from me. I don't want to have to do this. I don't want to have to deal with the pain and the toil and the struggle. No, He gives you the courage, the ability to get through it. I was talking to Eliana last night. She went through this event. She had one of these hoorahs. Someone comes in and they put these pictures on a table and they say, pick up a picture that reminds you of conquest. Pick up a picture that reminds you of fear. And then they have to sit around a room and they have to hold up the photo and then they have to say, what are you afraid of? They have to hold up another photo. What do you feel that you're going to conquer? And Eliana's looking at me going, what in the world? These people are like afraid of everything. She's like, what was I don't know, I didn't know what to say. And then I felt like, she was looking at me. She was connecting, and the woman said that some of you may not believe me. You may not think this is valuable. She's staring at me as she said it, and I felt like she was telling me, she was trying to force me into saying something. She said, I said, what'd you do? She said, I just stood there and stared at her. I said, well, you sound like your dad. But they're going to put you in a position where you have to sit there and accept your fear. Talk about it. Let's talk through it. Let's walk down that path together. And then the flip side of it is we are conquerors of that. There's no reason to be afraid of that. First of all, fear is real and struggle is real. It's real. You're going to have fear. You're going to have struggle. The question is, do you have the fortitude inside to continue through what you're afraid of? Because everything comes to an end. Not everything is forever. So you have to keep going. And how do you keep going? God gives you the strength. God gives you the ability to get through it. And so we have this understanding that we don't necessarily have the ability to remove the obstacle just because we're followers. God's not going to remove it. But He's going to bring us and give us the ability to be obedient within that battle. So Ki Teitzei begins with when you go out to war, because the kingdom does not promise us a life without enemies, resistance, suffering, hardship. It forms within us a people who can encounter those realities without surrendering the higher ground. There's going to be enemies here. There's going to be temptations that you face. There's going to be injustices that come your way. You're going to feel like you've been treated terribly, horribly. There's a grave injustice against me. This life, what has happened to me? This should never have happened. There will be circumstances that will awaken within you the characteristics that you should not have if you're an image bearer of God. Anger, lust, greed, fear, bitterness. Bitterness, people don't realize what bitterness actually does. Bitterness is like the root to everything else. If you're bitter, it leads to anger. If you're bitter, it leads to vengeance. It leads to pride. It leads to all sorts of problems if you're bitter. And bitter is just like, oh man, that shouldn't have happened that way. That's how bitterness starts. It's real simple. Did you hear what that person said to me? What was that about? Then you go home and you start thinking, you know what? I can't get that out of my head, what that person said. Why would they say that? And now all of a sudden that person is an absolute evil-minded, wicked person. They don't even know the Lord. Yeah, they do. They're just like you. And the fact that you're responding the way you do proves that they're just like you. And I'm not talking out of theory. This is real life experience I have. I've done this too. No one is exempt from this reality. We allow things to fester and we create an entire world of lies that create a wickedness that doesn't allow us to move in God's presence. In many respects, covenant faithfulness makes us more conscious conscious of the battle because we become increasingly aware of the difference between what God desires and what the flesh desires. That's the hardest part. When you're in the midst of the battle, is this the right thing or the wrong thing? Is this my desire or God's desire? Is this my flesh or is this God's presence? Paul describes this conflict when he speaks of the struggle between the flesh and the spirit. This is Galatians 5. Likewise, he reminds us, all believers, everyone in Ephesians 6, that ultimately our struggle is not against the flesh and blood. So this parashah actually is going to teach us something very unique, that everything is spiritual. It's not all just physical. Even that little argument that you have with your friend or your neighbor, it's spiritual. It's not all just an ordinary thing. And this is where we come to a fascinating insight that's hidden in the Scriptures, in the words, al oiveka. Literally, the word construction is against or upon your enemies. Al is upon or against your enemies. The earlier teaching that I developed in 2023, I took this phrase through this imagery of creating the higher ground. Whether or not we make the preposition itself carry the full weight of that, the spiritual picture is very, very compelling for us here. The Torah is teaching Israel how not to become the enemy while fighting the enemy. That's what taking the higher ground is. How do you not become the enemy while fighting the enemy? How do you maintain your moral character while you're fighting an enemy who has no moral character? When you go to war with Al-Qaeda, when you go to war with Hamas, with Hezbollah, when you go to war with these terrible terrorists, how do you not become one of them and maintain the higher ground? I came to this idea for this teaching as I reflected on the teaching from a couple weeks ago. If you remember, I provided you an example of an undercover police officer, a law enforcement agent. If you remember that story. If they remain undercover too long, what happens to them? This is one of the great dangers of living continually among people that you're trying to expose, is that the line between infiltrating their world and becoming a part of their world slowly begins to disappear. When you're undercover, that line blurs. The law enforcement agent begins to think like the enemy because he needs to understand them. He then starts to behave like them because he needs to convince them. Until eventually he can become the very thing that he was sent to take down. I have to convince you who I am, so I have to act like you. I have to do what you do. And so you justify things like, oh, hey, this guy over here needs taken out. You want to prove yourself? Go take that guy out. You think to yourself, well, he's a bad guy anyway, so it's all good. So you go take that guy out. You murder within the context of your job. You're doing it for your job as an undercover. He becomes a part of that, and sooner or later, he looks just like the people that he's trying to stop. And perhaps that's one of the deeper warnings that's hidden in this parashah, that Israel has to fight its enemy without allowing the character of its enemy to become its own character. There's always a danger that prolonged warfare is going to change the warrior that's out there. We say it. Men that go to war, they come back. When they came back from Afghanistan, they weren't the same person. When they come back from Iraq, it wasn't the same guy. Vietnam, for some of you older fellows, they weren't the same guy. Prolonged war changes a man. And so this is always the danger. When you're fighting hatred, guess what? You could become hateful. When you're confronting cruelty, guess what? You can become cruel. Anybody ever cruel to you? A bully? There's a bully in school, and your response to the bully is cruelty. You fight fire with fire. You become what you don't want to be against that person. Opposing evil, in opposing evil, we begin to employ the methods of evil ourselves. This is the challenge. And this is what this parasha is trying to teach us. The Torah is teaching that Israel is not just to how to defeat the enemy, but how not to become the enemy while fighting him. So that's the higher ground. So let's look at the first enemy, how it appears inside the victor. This is interesting. I mean, I don't think we've ever thought of it this way. I don't think that you've even thought of it this way. That you as a victor can be the enemy. How can the victor be the enemy? The warning not to become like them becomes apparent immediately in the opening verses of this parasha. Israel goes out to war. God delivers the enemy into their hands. And what begins as a conflict against an external adversary all of a sudden becomes something highly personal in this reading. God's going to give the enemy to them. But all of a sudden, it becomes personal. In the aftermath of victory, there's an Israelite soldier that looks among the captives and he sees this beautiful woman whom he desires to take for himself. And at that moment, the entire battlefield shifts. The immediate threat is no longer the enemy standing across from him with a weapon. That enemy has already been defeated. The battlefield's over. The greater struggle is now emerging within the victorious soldier himself, because victory has placed him in a position of power and it's exposed him to the desires of his own heart. Look what I've done. Now I can have anything. Look what I'm capable of. This is precisely where Israel has to learn that conquering an enemy doesn't necessarily mean that the battle's over. A man can defeat the enemy in front of him, but still be defeated by the enemy that's within him. So I can beat this guy, but I didn't beat the guy inside. There's a problem. And the question is no longer whether he possesses the strength to conquer another person. It's whether he possesses the discipline to govern himself. And so immediately after giving Israel victory on the battlefield, the Torah is placing boundaries. There's fences being created around the victorious man's desires. Remember, it starts with war, it ends with war, and in between it's all ordinary life. Well, ordinary life is your desires. God begins to put fences around those desires of the victory and of the people that won. He's teaching them that the higher ground has to be maintained even after the enemy has fallen. Even after you've won, you have to maintain the higher ground. And so it says, V'chashakta va, you desire her. The root chashak carries that idea, that desire, attachment, a longing for. Something that's, you're being strongly drawn towards something. This is important because Israel's conquered this external enemy, and the Torah is now confronting the internal appetite of the people of Israel. Rashi draws upon this famously, and he interprets the legislation concerning the captive woman, because that's what this is. There's a captive woman here, and there's legislation around it, and in the Torah it addresses what we all know as the Yetzer Hara, the inclination inside of man to do evil, to do wicked. So you've You've beaten the battle, you've beaten the enemy on the outside, but now you have a Yetzer Hara. You have an internal inclination to do bad that you have to muzzle, you have to control, you have to put railings around. And so we learn from that principle where it says winning the external battle doesn't mean I've won the internal one. And the danger of believing that escaping an enemy means we've escaped the influence of that enemy. That's the biggest danger. We won, but their influence can still continue on. That enemy can still influence me, and arguably it will forever. You ever hear of anybody that goes to war and they kill somebody and they say, I can't get the man's face out of my mind? I see him in my dreams. I can't overcome this. That influence will be forever. That war will be forever on your life, that influence. And so Israel could leave Egypt physically, but they still carry the desires and the fears and the patterns of Egypt within their hearts. That influence of Egypt is still there. How do we know that? Look what happened. Right going into the promised land. Spy out the land. Go check it out. Go see what we can do. There's big old grapes. All of us are, walking around with these grapes. We're ready to come into the land, and 10 of them are like, no way, we can't do it. Their fear, what they went through, the slavery they experienced, the overlording of Egypt, they saw it in the Amalekites and all of those that lived in Judea, those that lived in Israel, the promised land, across the Jordan, the giants, the Anakim. If Egypt was bad, these Anakim will be worse. We're like grasshoppers to them. The fear of Egypt still influenced them. They couldn't get out of it. A person that comes out of Babylon, while Babylon continues to shape the way they think, their value systems, how they respond to the world around them. You can't tell me that your experiences don't shape the way you think, that they don't influence you. Yes, you can come out of it and you can say that God changed me, transformed me, and that's the idea, right? Chokhmah, Da'at, Bina, we come to wisdom and knowledge and understanding, and we find truth, and that truth is found within the Torah, and the Torah then transforms us, and that's the idea. And we should live in that transformation and walk differently, but unfortunately, your experience does in fact shape some of what you've gone, how you think. So how do you take that and really transform it? We can overcome the person who wounded us and still discover that the bitterness created by that wound has gained a greater victory over us than the person ever did. So someone wounds you. That wound isn't, it's a wound. It's bad. It's terrible, and it's a bad thing that somebody wounds you. But the worst part of that wound is that you let it fester and you don't heal it and you don't put the ointment on the wound, and then it grows an infection, and the infection then spreads, and it's the infection that kills you. It's not necessarily the fact that you have the wound. If you would have treated the wound properly, it wouldn't have gotten infected, and the infection is what takes you. This is bitterness. Bitterness is the infection. Holding on to it. We can win arguments, but sacrifice our character in the process. We can successfully expose other people's wrongdoing, only to become harsh or vindictive and cruel in ways that we confront them. It's even possible to be completely correct about an issue while responding in a manner that no longer reflects the character of God that we claim to represent. I've been subject myself to that situation all the time. I know I'm right. So do I take, in a situation, do I take what I know I'm right and then use it as a hammer to harm? How do I react in a such situation with a person that I'm having an argument with, a conflict with? This is why taking the higher ground isn't just defeating the enemy standing before us. True victory has to include refusing to allow that enemy to determine what we become. If hatred produces hatred within us and cruelty causes us to become cruel, or if another person's unrighteousness becomes justification for our own unrighteous behavior, then we may have won the confrontation, but we lose the greater battle. And this is what God's trying to tell us. We can't allow their hatred to become our hatred or their cruelty become our cruelty. The higher ground is the place where truth and character remain joined together, where we confront what is evil without becoming shaped by the evil. The higher ground is maintaining the character of God while confronting them. It's hard to do. It's not easy. You're not going to just all of a sudden be that guy. I mean, I'll be honest with you. There's people out there. I think the opposite is also true. You know, I have the personality that if somebody raises their voice, unfortunately, my voice gets louder. I don't know why. It's like someone pushed the volume button. It's my reaction. But then there's people that react the complete opposite. And I think it's also just as disdainful, where they act extremely humble. Right? That's called passive aggression. If you think you're not being aggressive by being or appearing meek and lowly, it's the same. There's this medium, this in-between. I don't even know how to get to the in-between. But there's an in-between that God is trying to show us and teach us. That, you know, this passive aggression of looking lowly, meek, and humble versus this aggression of, I'm going to take you out right now, right? There's this place. And it's called perfect peace. And I think there's been moments in my life that I've experienced it. But never always. So you must understand, we have to understand, that perfect peace is there for us always, but it's a challenge to get there. The church will tell you, no, I'm in perfect peace right now. Right now, I'm in peace. Right now, I'm victorious. Aren't you victorious, brother? We're victorious, brother. This is the game. And then the whole place shouts, the whole place goes crazy, the whole place roars, and then everybody leaves excited and smiling and hugging, and that poor woman, that poor man, who shouted and screamed and yelled, and then goes home, opens their door by themselves, alone, walks into their home, sits down on their couch, and they're right back into the drama of their own life. And they think it's only them, when in reality it's everyone. They think it's only them because they thought they went to a place surrounded by all these victorious people, and I don't understand it. And they look at Facebook and look at all the victory on Facebook. Nobody shares their trauma on Facebook. If you do, the other trauma of people will make fun of your trauma while they're living in this terrible mess of themselves. This is the problem. Listen, life is real. Life is hard. It's a battle. It's milchama. It's war. But in between war, there's ordinary stuff. And how do we fix it? How do we guard it? We have to put boundaries around our appetites. We have to put boundaries around our desires, around our flesh, fences that protect us. Those aren't bad things. The church would say, oh no, I don't like the law. The law isn't for me. The law is bad. I told you a couple weeks ago, Eliana had to go to that church, with her group that she's with. And that the guy the pastor at the front of the church, who just is right down the street here, not locally, but down in another city. What's he say? The first 5 books are the most boring books of the Bible. That's what he says from the Bima. Eliana's like, that's literally the Torah, dude. We teach from the Torah, and we use the New Testament to support it. Guess who else did that? Yeshua. Guess who else? Every single disciple. What do you think they were teaching? The New Testament is about their Torah teachings. It's about their Torah teachings. And we just use what they wrote to support their understanding of it. So notice here that this Torah, these guidelines that we receive, what does he do with the victorious soldier? He doesn't permit unlimited power to this guy, to Israel. He says the captive woman cannot just become the object of your appetite. That's what he's telling them. The captive woman cannot become the object of your appetite. The Torah interrupts his desires with boundaries. It puts time on it, dignity, mourning, and responsibility. This is the characteristic of the entire parasha. Tasha went with the girls to the Sight and Sound Theater this last week, and they saw Joshua. And in there they highlight this thing in Joshua. They highlight that God tells Joshua to burn the chariots. That becomes one of the slogans. Burn the chariots and cripple the horses. So Tasha's like, why is God saying for them to burn the chariots and cripple the horses? Because the chariots and the horses can look like your own power. And you have to burn that so that God can, you put all your trust into God. You have to eliminate their weapons of war. It's not about their weapons of war. Don't take the enemy's weapons of war. Don't take the enemy's spoils. That's what Saul did. That's how Saul blew it, by the way. He was the king of Israel. How's he blow it? He takes the spoils for his kingdom. He allowed power to infiltrate his mind. And then that power then created evil. This is how he blew it. But the entire characteristic of the parasha is about this dignity. Now let's think about this. Teitzei, what does it do? It contains an extraordinary number of mitzvot. If you guys read it, I hope you did. You got bored. Just like the pastor tells us down the street, it's boring. There's 74 Torah commands just in this parasha. That's like more than 1 out of every 10 commandments there's in this parasha alone. So, according to Jewish tradition, more than 1 out of every 10 commandments is here, and perhaps the concentration in itself is part of the message. So, having introduced Israel as people going to war, Moshe now demonstrates that the battle for holiness will extend into virtually every area of their lives. The higher ground has to be maintained not only when Israel is facing our enemies on the battlefield, but in your home, in your marriage, in your business, in sexuality, in the treatment of the poor, in the handling of another person's property, even in the treatment of your animals. Covenant faithfulness is not demonstrated only in the great spiritual battles of life. So many think that. You had this great spiritual battle. Oh, man, you should see their prayer words, what they went through, and the way they fought spiritually for this. No. Covenant faithfulness is seen in your marriage. How you treated your wife before you went to bed last night. Your children. Yesterday, what did you do? This is covenant faithfulness. Not because you had a major event and you were able to, appear prayerful. God is seeing something different. He sees you in between the moments that other people see you. He sees you between the Facebook posts. So many people only see you at Facebook. God sees you between. Your thoughts, what you're thinking, how you're interacting with people, what you're saying, how you love your wife and your husband, and how you love your children. Covenant faithfulness is demonstrated and revealed in the ordinary decisions that we make when we possess the opportunity to choose between what we desire and what God commands, where human desire ordinarily says that I can do whatever I want. The Torah responds, no, you can't. Your strength has boundaries. Your anger has boundaries. The treatment of animals has boundaries. Your treatment of your employees has boundaries. Your architecture of your home has boundaries. The Torah tells you how you can build your home. There's even boundaries in the way you build it. Because covenant means that God has jurisdiction over every single part of your life. God has jurisdiction over you. This is where the large collection of mitzvot and Teitzei becomes essential to this message rather than a collection of unrelated laws. So many people think that. This is just a kind of a disjointed parasha. It's like, it starts with milchama, then it goes through and it gets to these 74 commandments, and then it goes back to Amalek and says, remember him. What is this? This is so disjointed. No, it's not. It's coming together nicely. You're at a battlefield. And the battlefield's not only with the enemy outside in the physical setting, in the field. Guess where else it is? It's in your mind. It's in your heart. You are a walking, living, breathing battlefield, and you have to overcome Yetzer Hara. And so put the boundaries where they belong to save you from the enemy, which is all around you. And this is where these commandments start to describe what the higher ground looks like. So let's take a moment to do that. What does the higher ground look like? Why do these commands teach us what the higher ground looks like? It looks like returning something that doesn't belong to you. That's what the higher ground is. You find something that doesn't belong to you, do you return it to the person? The higher ground would say, yeah. I found $100 outside this store. Wow, I found $100. I'm going to take it in here and spend it. The higher ground says, find the person that the $100 belongs to. That's hard to do. It's hard to do that. Right? How do you find that? It's not like there is an ID on it. What you could do is there's a guy down the street that's holds up a sign, and the sign says, I need some help. I have 4 kids. I'm out of work. Now, we all know that a lot of that's just a play and a ploy. But maybe you find somebody who is in need. And you take that $100 and you put it to work. That way. Rather than taking that $100 and going into Five Below and buying yourself a bunch of junk that you're going to end up throwing away in, a couple of weeks. Put food on that guy's table. That's an idea. That's a higher ground. Deuteronomy, Devarim 22 commands Israel not to ignore a brother's lost ox, his sheep, his donkey, his garment, or any other possession. How do I not? I shouldn't ignore your lost ox. How many people have oxen? Not many. But you do have other things. The temptation is, it isn't mine. It's not my responsibility to do this. Right? That's the temptation. Let me give you an example. I'm driving the other day, last week, I'm driving down the street. I'm following my wife. She's in a different car. There's this woman in a wheelchair in the middle of the street, Cleveland Massillon Road in Montrose. She's literally in the middle of the street, out of her wheelchair, with another lady behind her, trying to get her into the wheelchair, and every single car is driving around them. She's literally in the middle of the street. Here's the side of the road. Here's the other side of the road. Here's the woman. People are going all around these people. Did I stop? Yes, I had to. I'm obligated. Of course I did. I got out of the car. I said, "What are you doing, young lady?" She wasn't young, but "What are you doing?" "I need help. I need help." I said, "You clearly do. Let's get you in this chair." We get in the chair. We take her over to there's a sidewalk. Literally, there's a sidewalk. How'd they get into the middle of the street? It's like they walked through a portal, fing, and they're out there. It made no sense. I even looked at them. I said, "What are you guys doing? Why are you in the street?" "Oh, I can't even tell you, honey. I can't even tell you why." "Okay, well then don't. Let's just get you on the sidewalk." But everybody's going around these people. Why? It's not my responsibility. It's not my responsibility. You're right, it's not. But God would stop. You're the character of God, so you have to. Someone else is going to handle that. No, we don't need to get involved. Someone else will handle it. You have to get involved. The Torah commands you to. Covenant life refuses indifference. The higher ground says, what does love require of me? Yeshua would later make the same principle unmistakable in his teachings concerning the Good Samaritan. Asks you to ask yourself the question, what kind of neighbor am I becoming? What kind of neighbor am I? Some people would say, well, they're not my neighbor. They're not my neighbor. That commandment is only specific to your community. You ever hear that before? What a disaster. That's the lesson that we're learning? No. You're a neighbor to everyone in the world because everyone in the world bears the image of God, even if they act evil. They have the character of, they have the essence and the spark of the divine inside of them and the ability to find that fire and that light and to shine for Him. And so it's our responsibility to that neighbor as well. The higher ground resembles compassion when nobody is watching. If Israel encounters a bird sitting upon her young, we have this beautiful opportunity as a family. There's this bird nest sitting right on the light above our garage. And our children get to see these little baby birds just with their heads up and they're chirping, and there's 3 of them in the nest, and they're like, "Hey, the heads are out." And then the mother robin is flying in, feeding them back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I told my kids, believe it or not, I said, God commands not to mess with that mom. You leave that mom alone, because they'll come out and go, "Wah!" try to scare them. I said, you don't touch that mom, you leave the mom alone. The Torah commands you to leave the mom alone. She's caring for her young. You don't mess with that bird. The Torah tells us to leave her. This parasha is the one that tells you to leave the mother bird alone. Let her go. And if you plan on taking the mother bird's eggs, you allow her to fly away first before you take her eggs. The Torah does allow you to take her eggs, which is terrible. Anyone with their right mind wouldn't do that. Let the poor little birds live, and when they grow up and get fat enough, then we kill them and eat them. Eat them after they're fat. It's the same thing I do with groundhogs. I let baby groundhogs go. I'm going to kill you in about 6 months. but I'm going to give you a fighting chance. Maybe you can move, find another hotel. Not my yard. But 22:6-7 commands that the mother be released before taking her offspring. Think about the insignificance of this command. There's no human victim. There's no courtroom. There's no priest watching you. There's no rabbi. There's no pastor watching what you're doing. I literally am sitting there outside in my driveway, in my rocking chair, nice day, and the robin's flying back and forth, and I'm talking to the robin going, "You're doing such a good job. Treating your babies right, feeding them." I sound like a maniac talking to this bird, because I do. Go ahead, Mama, go get him. Don't be afraid of me. I'm just sitting here. I'm not going to mess with you. Go feed him. No one else sees me doing that, caring that way. Same thing for you. There's no one applauding for you. Only God and you and that bird. The Torah says that even there your character matters. Holiness is revealed by what we do when there is no human audience. The higher ground looks like building a railing around your roof. Ma'akeh, you ever know what that? You ever hear about that? The ma'akeh, the fence that goes around your roof. This is the higher ground. What does that mean? Deuteronomy 22:8, it says, "When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof." So now God's Torah command applies to your home building. You better put a fence on your roof. Ancient roofs in Israel were usable spaces. They could go out. They were flat. And so somebody building a house was responsible to do what? It was their responsibility to anticipate how their property could endanger another person. Well, that doesn't seem right. That I have to anticipate how you could be stupid? That's basically what it's saying. It's my responsibility to anticipate your stupidity? And God says, yep. The Sefer HaKanuk expands this principle to remove hazards and dangerous conditions from our dwellings. The rabbinic interpretation applies the command beyond roofs to other foreseeable dangers. But this gives us one of the strongest spiritual applications in the entire parasha, where covenant maturity asks, did I build something that could have prevented the fall? Or did I build something that caused the fall? You know how people always say, if I just would have done it this way, that wouldn't have happened. If I just would have did that. The Torah tells you to ask yourself that question before you do something, so that you're not asking yourself that question at the end. So what railings are around your marriage? What railings are around your children? What railings are around your eyes? We talked about a couple weeks ago how we let the world disciple our eyes. Our eyes are the disciples of the world. What railings are around our eyes? Our relationships, our congregation. Should we have railings around our congregation? Yes. Not everything should be allowed in. Not every voice should be allowed in. Confusion and mayhem and problems. We had a gentleman here a couple weeks ago who told my dad exited him out of the building because they had a theological debate issue. And the issue was that he was telling people he spoke to Moses this morning, and he spoke to individuals in the scriptures that are dead. And he's telling people that he's hearing from these people and that he's a prophet now. I'm a prophet. I hear from. Well, we have a small conversation, say, no, that's not biblical and it's not real. So he starts to get a little angry. My dad says, well, you don't have to come here. Well, then maybe I should leave. And Dad says, well, maybe you should. And so out he goes, and he leaves a bunch of messages and tells Dad that if he wants to know who Jesus is, to call him, because Dad doesn't know who Jesus is. What he doesn't understand is that Yeshua's not dead. That's why we speak to Yeshua. He's very much alive. You don't speak to Moshe. You don't speak to the dead. Do you know how much confusion that causes? Do you know the confusion in the faith that can cause? And then you allow that stuff to creep in, and then all of a sudden it creates this whole splinter group, and then you got all kinds of stuff going on. We can't do that. You have to put railings. Protect the sheep. That's a responsibility. The fences are okay, they're all right. There's nothing wrong with a fence. The fence becomes the Torah, then we got a problem. If the fence replaces God's law, then we got an issue. But sometimes holiness means that we're constructing something beforehand that prevents a fall. And Yeshua teaches his disciples to take sin seriously, enough to remove those things that continually lead them towards stumbling. We can't allow people to be led towards stumbling. So we have to watch and be vigilant. The Torah calls it a ma'akeh, a fence, a boundary, a deliberate structure that's doing what? Protecting life. Protecting the life of your children, protecting the life of your marriage, protecting the life of your relationships, of your congregation, of your people. We have to protect the life. The parashah then moves from the fences and it enters economics. This is interesting. What's it say? That a worker has to be paid. It says a debtor has to retain dignity. The poor cannot be exploited. A person's desperate circumstances cannot become another person's opportunity for domination. 24:14-15 of Davarim specifically warns against withholding the wages of a poor hired worker. Why would the Torah care when someone's paychecks arrive? Why? Why does the Torah care about your paycheck? Because the kingdom of God cannot be separated into spiritual and ordinary categories. How we treat people financially is spiritual. How we conduct business is spiritual. How employers treat employees is spiritual. How we treat someone who owes us something is spiritual. How we behave when we possess economic leverage over another human being reveals whether Torah has penetrated our hearts. James confronts this kind of injustice when he condemns wages fraudulently withheld from laborers in James 5:4, which proves that the Brit Chadashah doesn't abandon the Torah's moral vision here and is actually saying the same thing. It's teaching from the Torah, not something new, which people, want to believe. But it calls the community of Mashiach back into the Torah. Deuteronomy 25:4, it gives us the shortest commandment in the parashah. This is funny. What's this commandment? You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. It's the shortest commandment. What in the world does that mean? The animal working in the harvest has to be permitted to eat. You can't muzzle it because it has to be permitted to eat. It's working hard. And Paul uses this command in 1 Corinthians 9:9-10, and again in 1 Timothy 5:18, and he sees a principle that's embedded within. It says God's commandments reveal the character of God, and that character teaches us how human beings should treat one another. If God cares about the ox working the field, how much more should his people care about human beings laboring with them? This is why Yeshua can summarize Torah around love of God and love of neighbor without diminishing it in total. He's revealing its center. And the mitzvot, which we find in this parashah, teach us what love looks like when love becomes behavior. And so this brings us directly to our Mashiach, Yeshua. He doesn't just teach the higher ground. He is. He is the higher ground. When he was insulted, does he become the insult? When he was falsely accused, does he become false? When he's betrayed, does he lose his faith? He was hated, and he didn't become hatred. He was confronted by sinners on a regular basis, and he didn't compromise his holiness. But neither does holiness become cruelty, and he didn't become cruelty. He became more and more loving. At his crucifixion, he was surrounded by violence, humiliation, injustice, mockery, and Yeshua refused to allow the character of his enemies to determine his own character. Kepha describes Yeshua's response to suffering in 1 Peter 2:21 through 23. It says, when reviled, he did not revile in return, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. That may be one of the clearest messianic expressions of Teitzei. The world says, treat people according to what they deserve. The Messiah says, respond according to who you belong to. Respond to the world according to who you belong to. That doesn't eliminate justice. It means evil does not get to determine who we become. And that's why Paul says something very important to you and I. He says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:21. This is the commentary for the entire Teitzei. That's scripture alone. If you want to know what Teitzei says, right now, that's it. That's the whole commentary. And then as we get through to the bottom of this parasha, what happens? After the laws concerning your family, after the laws concerning how you build your home, after the laws concerning how you treat your animals in the field, and your workers, and the debtors, and marriage, and sexuality, and justice, and commerce, and human dignity, all these laws are embodied within this parasha. After all of that, Moshe suddenly says, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. All of a sudden, he says, remember what Amalek did to you. What? Why? Why end it here? He starts with, when you go out to war, and then he says, oh, build a fence around your house. Treat your ox very well. Return the property of your friend to him. Blah, 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 blah. And he goes and says, oh, but by the way, remember what Amalek did. It feels like it's completely disjointed. But it's not. Because Amalek represents something completely opposite to everything Israel has just been commanded to become. They've been commanded to be, they were commanded to become something special. And Amalek is the antithesis of that becoming. And so Deuteronomy says that Amalek attacked you on the road and struck you at your weakest point in the rear. The weakest people that were in the back were struck. And the Torah says, Ayef vayagea. What does that mean? When I say ani ayef, it means I'm tired. I want to go to bed. Ani ayef. I want to go sleep. It says the faint, the ayef, the vayagea, the weary. Amalek attacked them because he's weak himself. And so Amalek represents the very opposite of the covenant ethic that the Torah has been establishing. Amalek looks upon weakness and sees the opportunity to exploit it. Oh, I can exploit that. Look, they're tired. I'm going to go take them out. And the Torah looks upon weakness and sees the responsibility to protect it. So what do we got to do? We have to go protect the weak. That poor lady that was getting in her wheelchair, she had a big purse with her. And so did the lady that was with her. And they couldn't hardly get in the wheelchair. She was very heavy-set lady, couldn't get in the wheelchair. The other lady was holding the wheelchair, trying to hold it as she was trying to get up in it. I mean, she was a very heavy-set lady. She was really, really struggling. You know, what would Amalek do? Pull the car aside, get out, and go take their purses, and they could do nothing about it. Exploiting the weakness. Taking what was theirs. Amalek attacks the straggler who's fallen behind. The Torah commands Israel to concern itself with the property its neighbor has lost. Amalek takes advantage of those who are faint and exhausted. The Torah commands the employer to consider the needs of the vulnerable worker and pay his wages before the sun goes down. Amalek disregards the welfare of those who cannot protect themselves, while the Torah requires a man to build a railing around his roof before someone ever has the opportunity to fall. In each instance, the distinction isn't between the two different sets of behaviors. It's between two fundamentally different ways of understanding power. The world is represented by Amalek, where strength gives a person permission to exploit weakness, and power becomes the means by which someone determines what he is entitled to do. Torah turns the understanding completely upside down. It says the more power God places into your hands, the greater your responsibility becomes for how that power is used. Strength is not permission to exploit. It creates an obligation to protect. Authority is not your opportunity to serve yourself. It's the opportunity to reflect the character of God. And this is why Teitzei begins with Israel confronting an enemy and concludes by commanding Israel to remember Amalek. Because God is not concerned that his people will defeat their enemy. He's determined that in defeating them, his people never become like them. Amalek allows all the power to determine what is right, but the Torah says, create a people in whom righteousness determines how power is used. So in conclusion, the battle is for what kind of people we will become. Teitzei begins when you go out to war against your enemies. It says, Teitzei la milchama al oivecha. And it ends with Zachor Amalek. Remember him. And between those statements, God gives Israel commandments after commandment after commandment, teaching them how to live. And why? Because perhaps the greatest danger to Israel and what they faced was not that Amalek would destroy them. It was that Israel would eventually begin behaving like them. And this is still the battle. We live in a culture that's increasingly willing to humiliate people we disagree with, to destroy people who offend us, to exploit weaknesses, to celebrate vengeance, to disregard covenant boundaries, to determine morality according to our own desires. I mean, you hear it, our own president. I mean, the whole Christian in our world thinks President Trump is God's Mashiach. They believe that. He was meant to save Israel. God saves Israel, people. You think Donald Trump saves Israel? That has nothing to do with it. Now, I'm not against Donald Trump, but I'll tell you this. The things he says, getting vengeance on people, getting back at people, how he's going to exploit them, the things that he says, that's not what this Torah parasha teaches us. You could see it. That's the world. It's the world. And guess what? I expect him to say it. Why? Because he's in the world. He was our best option, arguably. And so we chose him. We chose him. That's the facts. God is our king. There's only one king, and it's God. The temptation is that we fight the world, is to fight that world using the world's weapons. We can't fight the world using their weapons. Burn the chariots. Cripple the horses. Paul says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Do not descend. Do not become what you are fighting. Do not surrender your higher ground. Victory belongs to God. Our responsibility is faithfulness. And this is where our hope in Yeshua changes how we understand the battle. Through his death and resurrection, Mashiach has already confronted and overcome the two enemies that humanity, in its own strength, could never ultimately defeat. What is it? The power of sin and death, inevitably. But remarkably, Yeshua conquered them not by becoming more violent than the violence directed toward him, but through obedient self-giving, through kenosis, through Yeshua's voluntary self-emptying or self-humbling and becoming human and taking the form of a servant. The apparent lowest place became the highest ground, and the execution stake, the crucifixion, became the place of victory. Death was the doorway to resurrection. And so Revelation continues to describe the people of Messiah with one extraordinary word, and they say, he who overcomes. We say it every week. What's Revelation tell you? The one who conquers, the one who overcomes what? Hardships, trials, the battlefield. The kingdom belongs to overcomers. Not people who never encounter battles, or people who are never wounded, or who are never struggled. People who refuse to surrender their allegiance to God in the middle of the battle, not to surrender their allegiance to God. So ask yourself, who are you becoming while you fight your enemy? Are you becoming bitter? Are you becoming angry, cynical, merciless, governed by your own desires and flesh? Or are you becoming more like Yeshua or Mashiach? Because sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating the enemy standing in front of us. The greatest victory is what? Making certain that the enemy standing in front of us doesn't reproduce himself inside of us. So build the fence, return what was lost, and protect the vulnerable. Pay what you owe, honor the dignity of others, and control your appetite. Remember Amalek. These are the things of this parasha to remember. Follow the Mashiach, and when the battle comes, what do? All oiveka. Take the higher ground. Amen? It is our duty to praise the Master of all, to ascribe greatness to the author of creation, for he made us unlike the nations of the lands and has not placed us like the families of the earth. He's not made our portion like theirs and our lot like all their multitudes, and we bend the knee and bow and acknowledge our thanks before the King over kings, the Holy One. Blessed is he. He stretches out heaven and establishes earth's foundation. The seat of his glory is in the heavens above, and the presence of his power is in the most exalted heights. He's our God. There's none other. True is our King. There's nothing beside him, as it is written in his Torah. You shall know this day and take to your heart that the Lord, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth below. There is none other. Amen.